No lo conectar con nada externo, lo que quieren es que conectes con algo externo y hagas una especie de pactos o contratos.
Lo ocultan, es una manipulación mundial, dormir a la gente que tiene percepción para que se callen. Y es a nivel mundial, están todos compinchados.
They're not physical. You can't get rid of them by physical means. It's a spiritual battle.
Jerry Marzinsky es un psicoterapeuta jubilado con licencia y más de 35 años de experiencia trabajando y estudiando los procesos de pensamiento de pacientes psicóticos y criminales dementes en algunas de las instituciones psiquiátricas más volátiles del país. Comenzó su carrera en el Central State Hospital, en ese momento el hospital psiquiátrico más grande del planeta. En 2023 se convirtió en practicante certificado de MACE. Fue allí donde advirtió por primera vez las evidentes contradicciones entre lo que le habían enseñado sobre la esquizofrenia en la Torre de Marfil y lo que él presenciaba y aprendía de sus pacientes esquizofrénicos. Después de dejar el hospital estatal, Jerry trabajó en varios centros de salud mental de primera línea, incluidas prisiones estatales, hospitales psiquiátricos, privados y del condado, centros de salud mental y salas de emergencia de hospitales. A lo largo de su carrera, interrogó a decenas de pacientes esquizofrénicos y les extrajo información sobre sus voces, que la psiquiatría consideraba alucinaciones que no merecían ser investigadas. Años de investigación dieron como resultado el descubrimiento de que estas voces no solo tenían patrones conscientes, repetibles y predeciblemente negativos, muy diferentes de todas las demás alucinaciones, sino que además era posible mantener conversaciones coherentes con ellas, independientemente del paciente. Después de años de investigación, Jerry determinó que las voces no solo no eran alucinaciones sin sentido, como insistía la psiquiatría, sino que eran la fuerza que impulsaba la esquizofrenia paranoide. Esto dio lugar a una serie de experimentos de ensayo y error en busca de métodos para interrumpirlas. A medida que se fueron encontrando métodos cada vez más favorables, se hizo evidente una conclusión. Si las voces podían silenciarse por cualquier medio durante un tiempo prolongado, todos los síntomas de la esquizofrenia paranoide desaparecían y el paciente volvía a la normalidad. Esto dio inicio a la búsqueda de los métodos más eficaces para interrumpir las voces, que no dependieran de los fármacos caros y tóxicos de la psiquiatría, que no curaban nada y solo suprimían temporalmente los síntomas psicóticos. Con el tiempo se encontraron soluciones que dieron como resultado la cura completa de muchos casos, un fenómeno que la clase dirigente insiste en que no existe. Jerry se jubiló como evaluador psiquiátrico en 2015, después de trabajar en situaciones de crisis psiquiátrica en salas de urgencias de hospitales durante los últimos 10 años de su carrera. Fue después de jubilarse que se sintió libre de hablar sobre estos hallazgos y cuestionar el lamentable fracaso de nuestro costoso carrusel de servicios de salud mental, alimentado por fármacos. Además de sus aventuras en la primera línea de investigación sobre la esquizofrenia, Jerry es piloto comercial con licencia y buceador certificado desde 1972. En su tiempo libre vuela planeadores de alto rendimiento y disfruta de viajes en motocicleta por todo el país con amigos. Es un ávido explorador de la naturaleza, los fenómenos no físicos y el desarrollo espiritual. Jerry ha ocupado el puesto de segundo teniente en la Patrulla Aérea Civil de Arizona, donde ha realizado misiones de búsqueda y rescates sobre Arizona durante más de 23 años. También se desempeñó como asistente de Scoutmaster y recibió el premio al servicio meritorio del estado de Arizona por el desarrollo de un programa para prisioneros. Su formación académica formal incluye una licenciatura en psicología de la Universidad de Temple, una maestría en asesoramiento de la Universidad de Georgia y 2 años de estudio en un programa de doctorado en psicología. Puede verse su extenso currículum y seguir su trabajo en su web jerrymarzinsky.com. Hola a todos de nuevo, bienvenidos a nuestros canales. Haganor, ¿qué tal?
Bien, bien, Manu. ¿Y tú qué tal?
Pues aquí otra vez contento de que tenemos un invitado muy especial. Él es Jerry Marzinsky. Hola, ¿cómo estás, Jerry?
Bien.
Bueno, pues Jerry es la persona que se está haciendo muy importante en este mundo de las entidades. Bueno, ya es importante, lleva tiempo. Y a través de su trabajo con esquizofrénicos o gente aparentemente esquizofrénica y aparentemente con problemas mentales, se dio cuenta que las voces que escuchan estas personas realmente son entidades parasitarias. Y ha llegado a conclusiones muy parecidas a las que hemos llegado nosotros y otra gente, otros investigadores, por medio de sus investigaciones. Él estuvo décadas trabajando con este tipo de pacientes, ha trabajado en grandes hospitales y ha trabajado también en prisiones. Entonces, pues podríamos decir que ha conocido a cientos y cientos de personas con estos problemas y que tienen mucha experiencia en esto. Además, él escribe muchos artículos y tiene un libro muy interesante, que es este, que también lo tenemos en español, que se llama Un viaje increíble a la mente psicótica, rompiendo el hechizo de la Torre de Marfil, que cuenta sus experiencias con sus pacientes y cómo llegó a este tipo de conclusiones, ¿no? Tras un largo recorrido profesional, Jerry, ¿cómo descubriste la existencia de estas entidades parasitarias en tus pacientes? Y ya que tú estabas dentro de este mundo tan oficial, podríamos decir, ¿qué supuso este descubrimiento para ti?
So to start off with, after I got out of graduate school, I found a job at the biggest mental hospital on the planet. It was the size of a small city. There were 10,000 patients there when I got there, and nothing in my education prepared me for what I was going to experience there. Once I got there, it was very different from what they taught me in school. Very, very different. I was working at a psychiatric rehabilitation center. So what we were trying to do was to get these people functional. And the way the only thing we had back then was medicines. Nothing else they had. They didn't have anything else. It was just drugs. Okay. Talking to schizophrenics, counseling with them, it was like talking to a rock. It didn't faze them at all. There wasn't hardly any change. Right? So they were completely reliant on medications. And what I noticed is that almost all the patients eventually stopped taking those medications, which made no sense to me because the medications were the only things that would keep them sane or anywhere near sane. So that was puzzling. And one day I was doing rounds on the first floor of the psychiatric unit, and the maintenance man was cutting off one end of a banister that went up to the second floor. So it was like a hollow pipe that was like a banister, and it went up the first floor and all the way to the second floor. The cap at the top of the stairway on the second floor was missing. So you could throw stuff down in the banister. Now, I never thought about that. I did notice that cap was missing. And one day on the first floor, I was walking by, and a maintenance man had a grinder, and he was cutting the cap, the metal cap, off of the banister on the first floor. So that was the most exciting thing happening at the time. So I stopped, and with a bunch of patients, we were all watching him cut that banister in half, and sparks were flying all over the place, and there was smoke, and it was the most exciting thing happening at the moment. So we all stopped and watched the sparks and the banister. When that cap fell off, thousands of pills fell out of that banister. They had been throwing pills in that banister for decades, and most of them were antipsychotic pills. So it was like, why were they throwing their medicines away when the medicine was the only thing that kept them sane? That was a big puzzle to me. Thousands of them. It was like a waterfall of pills coming out of that banister, and they went all over the floor. And I noticed that most of them were antipsychotic drugs for schizophrenics. first question in my mind was, why are they throwing away their medicines? Why are they choosing to stay crazy? So as time went on, I had a caseload, and I usually had schizophrenics on that caseload. And they were among the brightest of the patients. They had the most potential, but the voices would keep tripping them up. You know, if they listened to the voices, they would get into trouble. And almost all of them at one time or another went off their medications. And again, that same question came up. Why are they choosing to go insane? You know, why are they throwing away their pills? So they had to put them on watch swallow. So they would give them their medicine, and then they would watch as they took them to make sure they swallowed them. Otherwise, a lot of times they'd go and they'd spit them out into a trash can when the attendant wasn't looking. So that was one big question on my mind. Why is this happening? So I did a little experiment. You know, if they went off their medications 3 times at this rehab center and they went crazy, we would discharge them, because if they wouldn't take their medications while they were being handed to them by the nurse, they certainly weren't going to take them when they were out on their own, when they had to go drive to a mental health center or see a doctor or go through some kind of trouble to get those medications. If they wouldn't take them while they're being handed to them, they're certainly not going to take them on the outside when nobody's forcing them to. So we would discharge them and just keep the ones that would stay on their medications. So that was a puzzle for a long time. So what I did is, every time one of these patients would go off their medications, I would ask them, why did you stop taking your medications? You knew you were going to get crazy if you stopped your medications. Of course, they said, well, we don't like the side effects. The side effects are awful, which is true. The side effects are just awful, right? But the effect of being crazy is much worse. You know, they have nightmares, they're seeing monsters, they're hearing voices telling them they were going to kill them. The voices are telling them that other people are going to kill them. They won't let them sleep at night. They're calling them names. It's an absolute hell. It's like hell on earth with these voices. They were like demonic voices speaking to these people. So what I did is did a little experiment. Every single time one of them would go off their medications on my caseload, I would bring them in and I'd say, why'd you go off your medicines? Of course, they'd say, well, because of the side effects. The side effects are awful. So I went to the DSM-3, the psychiatrist's Bible, and I wrote down all the effects of being psychotic. You know, all the bad things that they had written there about being psychotic: hearing voices, paranoia, being called names, being lied to by the voices. I mean, it's just absolute hell. And then I would give them a 1 to 10, or I'd say, write down all the side effects of the medications you were on, because they didn't all have the same side effects. Okay, so they would write down a handful of side effects, and then I'd give them the list of all the things rotten about being psychotic, about being crazy, and there was like 2 pages of them, and I'd say, check all of these symptoms that you had while you were crazy, while you were off your meds and going crazy. And they would check them, a whole bunch of them up, and then I'd hand both papers back to them and I'd say, which one is worst? The side effects of the meds or being insane? Which one is worse? All of them would say being insane. And then I'd ask them, why did you stop taking your medicines then? And their answer, for 3 years, I kept asking the same question. Their answer was, because the voices told me that I was being poisoned. Now, first they would say, I don't know. For 3 years, they said, I don't know. And they had no idea why. They just say, I don't know why I stopped taking them. And then on the 7th year I was at the hospital, we had one girl who was about to be discharged. Okay. her mother called me and said, please don't discharge her. I can't deal with her at home. She won't take her meds. Don't do it. I'll come up and we'll find out why she wasn't taking her meds. And so she came up, and both of us were begging her, why did you take your meds? You were doing good in school. She was in cosmetology class. You're doing good in school now, and you stopped taking your meds, and now we're about to discharge you. Why did you do that? And she said, you won't believe me if I told you. And her mother started begging her, and both of us were begging her, tell us why you did that. She said, the voices were telling me that the psychiatrists were poisoning me. And they pointed to the side effects of the medications, saying that was the effects of being poisoned. And indeed, it was true. Those meds are toxic. They are poisonous. They will shrink the patient's brain. If they use them long enough, they actually shrink the brain. They destroy the nervous system. So they're very toxic substances. They shouldn't be used long term. They should only be used short term, and then something else come in and take something else needs to be done, because they're destructive medications. What I'd noticed when I first got there was that psychiatrists were being beat up at a rate higher than any of the other staff, and they were spending less time with the patients than any of the other staff. Right? So they would spend, and this was a state hospital, so it was a state government hospital. They would spend 15, 20 minutes a month with these patients, and they were being assaulted by schizophrenics at a rate almost equal to that of attendants that were on the ward with them 24 hours a day. Okay? That made no sense to me until this girl told me that the voices were telling her that the psychiatrists were poisoning her. And then it clicked. It was like, okay, that's what they're telling these other patients also, that the psychiatrists are poisoning them. And that's why the schizophrenics were attacking them at a rate higher than any other staff at the hospital, other than the attendant staff. Another thing I noticed when I got to the state hospital was that none of the staff, there were hundreds of staffs there. It was the size of a small town. There were 200 buildings there. They sprawled over 3,000 acres. It was a small town. They had their own food factory. They had their own hospital. It was like a small town of mentally ill people. It was huge. But none of the staff, and there were hundreds of staff there, if not, many hundreds, none of them were interested in what the voices were telling these patients. And I'm like, you could see that there was a correlation between when they listened to these voices, that they would get into trouble. They would get into fights. They would get into arguments. They would get paranoid. So it was clear that there was a link between their maladaptive behavior and listening to the voices. But none of the staff were interested in what the voices were telling these patients. They weren't even curious about it. What I started doing was started asking the schizophrenics on my caseload what the voices were telling them. They didn't like that because there is no benefit to them telling somebody who's working for psych or a counselor or the psychiatrist that they're hearing voices, because all the psychiatrists would do would increase their medication. So one of my jobs working in the psychiatric units was to watch the population in that particular unit. And if any of the schizophrenics started getting out of control, was to turn them into psychiatry, who would either increase their meds or add more drugs or change the drugs. It was always around drugs. They didn't spend any time talking to these people other than, what are the voices doing? Are you hearing hallucinations? So there was no benefit to them telling anybody about the voices. If they tell their friends left them, they got scared, you're possessed, something's really wrong with you, you're really strange, and the friends would leave. If they tell their parents would drag them into the psychiatrist's office. The psychiatrist would say, well, you got schizophrenia, it's incurable, you got to take these meds for the rest of your life. And then they'd put them on these awful meds that made them feel awful, like zombies. You know, so there, and in the hospital, if they told a nurse or a psych or a counselor that they were hearing voices and having trouble controlling them, they ended up in front of the psychiatrist again, and their medications were again boosted up until they were drooling. I mean, until they were walking zombies, right? And none of them wanted to feel that way, right? So they were very hesitant to tell me anything about their voices. So I would get little bits here and there. Some of them would see that I was very curious about what the voices were, and they'd tell me one little thing, and another one would tell me another little thing about the voices. And I'd start collecting this little collection of things I knew about the voices. And the more I knew about them, the easier it was to get them to talk to them, because I could approach a new guy on the ward and say, tell me what these voices are telling you. This is what I know. I know they're negative. I know they're anti-religious. All the things I knew about them. And they would see that I was different from the other psychs that would just go, well, they're hallucinations. That I was serious about wanting to know what these things were and what they were telling them. So little by little, I got piece by piece by piece. And the more I learned, the more I could tell them, till I got to the point where I knew more about their voices than some of them did. Okay. And then they would open up, and they would see that I wouldn't turn them into psychiatry unless they were dangerous. So they would give me more information. But one of them got upset when I was asking him about his voices, and he went and told the psychiatrist. The next morning, I was called into the psychiatrist's office, and the psychiatrist was scolding me, saying, "You will not ask these patients about their voices anymore. They're hallucinations. They're not real. And when you ask them about these voices, all you're doing is reinforcing their hallucinations." And he threatened me. That happened twice.
Okay.
So they didn't want anybody investigating what the voices were. So there was like an unwritten law in the psych hospital that staff don't do anything to upset psychotic patients that they don't have to do. If you were asking questions that wasn't necessary, they don't want to risk upsetting them, because psychiatrists are getting beat up by them. So I think they were afraid of them. They didn't want anybody upsetting them. Okay. So I had to be very careful, because that happened twice. There were two psychiatrists told me, don't be asking them questions. You're upsetting them. And they did get a little bit upset. So I had to really back down and fly under the, keep a low profile. I didn't stop asking them questions, but I had to be very careful not to upset them, so they didn't go running to a psychiatrist again, and then I'd get in trouble and they'd write me up. I'd be in trouble with the institution. So one of the things I noticed is in asking them questions was that the voices were consistently negative. They were always telling them bad things. They were mocking them. They were making fun of them. It was always negative, constantly negative. They didn't say anything good whatsoever. It was all bad. So I'm kind of wondering, like, the psychiatrist would say they are hallucinations. That's what they're teaching in medical school. That's what they taught me in graduate school, that the voices are hallucinations, right? But if they're consistently negative, well, why aren't they random like all other hallucinations? I mean, hallucinations are all over the place. They're positive, they're negative, they don't make any sense. There's no pattern to them. You can't predict them. These voices were consistently negative. They were always negative. And if they said anything positive, it was only to sneak around behind the patient and stab him in the back later. It was always negative. So my question was, why aren't these voices, if they're hallucinations, like the psychiatric mafia says they are, why aren't they random also? Why is it running a consistent, predictable pattern that they're always negative? What holds them on a negative trajectory? How come they aren't random? So that was the first pattern I discovered, and kind of went, okay, if these things are running patterns, they can't be hallucinations. So I started looking for other patterns. And so The second oddity that came up is I had a patient once come into my office and we were talking about his voices. He said, when I read the 23rd Psalm, he said, the voices react like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. I found that interesting. So what I did is I got the 23rd Psalm and I started handing it out to my other patients who were hearing voices. And I said, every time you hear the voices, repeat this Psalm and come back to me in a week and tell me what happened. The voices absolutely hated it. They got louder, they got angry, they started screaming, they started gnashing. They absolutely hated it. So I went, that's odd. Why would a hallucination hate the 23rd Psalm?
Llegó un momento, según he visto en el libro, que tú hablabas, Jerry, directamente con las voces, y mentalmente también, telepáticamente, sin que tuvieras que hablar directamente con el paciente, ¿no? Y te respondían.
They did at one time. And that was years later. I'll tell you the story later, but they warned me. You know, they were warning me to back off. They told me, you have no right to interfere with our way of life. But that was years after the state hospital, when I was working at the state prison. So I would carry on some conversations with the voices through the patient. So the patient would tell me, now this was when I was working in the prison. The patient would tell me what the voices were saying, and I would talk to the voices through the patient. They weren't nice. Okay. And they didn't like me. While I was working at the state hospital, I didn't know enough about them. I didn't even know what they were. I was just finding these oddities about them that didn't make any sense. You know, so what I noticed one day when I was making rounds on my ward was that the chaplain was running a ice cream social, a dance down in the auditorium. And the only patients that stayed on the floor in the dingy ward were the schizophrenics. They didn't go down there to get ice cream and cake and dance and listen to music. They just laid in their beds and were staring at the ceiling or were reading, you know, nasty horror stories, magazines. It was all negative stuff they were reading. So I noticed that the first time and I went, well, that's odd. The second time it happened, they were all up there again. So I started asking them, how come you're not down there with the other guys? How come you're, you know, because cake and ice cream were hard to come by there. I said, how come you're not down there dancing and having cake and ice cream with the rest of them? You know, and they said, well, we don't like the preacher. We don't like listening to preachers. They're, you know, we prayed to God and he never answered any of our prayers, and we don't want anything to do with church and religion, and that you know, there is no God, or, you know, they didn't want anything to do with the church or the preacher or religion or anything. They just didn't. Okay, so it was like odd. Then I did another study kind of thing, and I would ask them all, did you ever go to church? And while we're hearing the voices, and almost all of them did try to go to church because they felt there was something evil about these things. So they tried to go to church, and I found they broke down into three categories. If the voices were very weak in the patient, when they went into the church, the voices shut up. They just went quiet. If they were medium strength, they got much louder. They would interfere with listening to what the preacher had to say. They would start mocking the preacher and make fun of him. They would make fun of the church. They would say stuff like, Jesus Christ can't even save himself. What makes you think he's going to save you? You know, just all this stuff, mocking the preacher, making fun of him, blocking what the preacher had to say. And the poor patient had to struggle to listen to what the preacher was saying. If the voices were very strong, they would actually drive the guy out of the church. He would get up and run out of the church.
Si quieres, sobre el tema de la iglesia, después lo podemos comentar, que nosotros tenemos nuestras ideas y percepciones sobre eso.
Tú, cuando has investigado a los pacientes y tal que tienen este tipo de voces, ¿detectan los animales, las mascotas que tienen en casa? ¿Estos pacientes detectan a estas entidades?
Well, they didn't allow pets in the mental hospital. So they didn't have any pets. They didn't allow pets in the prison. They didn't allow pets in the mental health centers. You know, it's I do know that pets can see things like ghosts and stuff like that, that people can't see. But so during all my investigations in my work sites, they didn't have any pets there. So I can't really honestly answer that question, but I know that they can see these things. They can sense these things.
Okay.
Schizophrenics usually don't treat pets very well. So once I saw this religious stuff, I mean, the voices were consistently, we're talking consistently all the time. Seldom. Now, they would fake like they were Jesus Christ, or they would fake like they were some kind of angel, but they can fake like they're anything. So they try to get these patients to believe like they're Jesus or they're God or something like that. But for the most part, they're consistently anti-religious. They resist the victim attending church, reading the Bible, following any positive spiritual path. They become volatile. If the patient repeats the 23rd Psalm or the Lord's Prayer or any other spiritual verses, they get angry. They don't like it. Why would a hallucination care about religion? I mean, why would that happen? Why would a hallucination consistently react negatively to anything religious? That made no sense to me. So here's the first two patterns I noticed, and they were consistent. It happened to all of them all the time. It was like a one-to-one correlation. This is how the voices behaved. Okay? The third thing I noticed is that the voices would always tell the patient bad things. You're stupid, you're ugly, everybody hates you, your mom hates you, they're just faking like they like you. People are laughing at you, people are talking about you behind your back. Anything they could say to upset the patient, they would say it. And 80% of it was lies. 90% of it was lies. They would tell the patient anything they could to get them upset. It was that's what they were working to do. They were working to upset the patient, to get them angry, to get them paranoid, to get them feeling bad. And then I noticed that after the voices attacked, the patients had no energy left. They couldn't even get out of bed to go eat breakfast. Their energy was gone. And this was a one-to-one correlation. It happened all the time. When the voices attacked the patient, they didn't have any energy left. It was consistent. It happened every time. So I would ask the patients, I'd say, every time the voices come, your energy drops down to zero, doesn't it? They go, yeah, it does. And a lot of them didn't even notice that. But when I talked about it, they go, yeah, it does. And now that you say it, it does. I said, where do you think your energy went? You were laying in bed all night tossing and turning, and the voices were attacking you and mocking you. You weren't burning up any energy, but yet you wake up in the morning and you're more drained. One guy said he was so drained he felt after in the morning, he felt like he was digging ditches in the hot sun all day. So that's how drained they were. They were so drained, some of them couldn't even get up and eat breakfast. They couldn't get out of bed. And I would ask them, I said, well, where do you think your energy went? You didn't use it. You were just laying in bed all night. Where do you think it went? The voices were attacking you, and you wake up in the morning, you don't have any energy. What do you think happened? And they would say, well, I don't know. I don't know where my energy went. It was like consistent. They noticed the energy was gone, but they didn't make a link between the voices and the energy leaving. So I'd ask them, listen, if you stuck your hand in a fire 500 times and every time you got burned, what was burning you? They didn't have any trouble with, the fire. And then I'd say, well, you've been hearing voices for 10 years. Every time the voices come, your energy is gone. Where do you think your energy went? Well, I don't know. They didn't know. Some of them would go, did the voices take it? It's like, so they were being blocked from realizing that there was a correlation between the voices showing up and their energy leaving. So it looked to me like the voices were parasites. They were turning their emotional state negative, and then they were sucking the energy out of the patient. Third pattern.
Jerry, ¿has podido grabar o captar estas voces en tus pacientes con cámaras, un dispositivo para grabar y se han dirigido directamente a ti porque les estabas molestando?
I know somebody who got one. They're a paranormal investigator up in Tennessee. Okay, and she played that recording of his schizophrenic, the voices, and it was clear. You know, so I had her on my, I interviewed her and put her testimony on there. So yeah, when she played that back, you could actually hear the voice saying something. I mean, I forgot what that was saying, but yeah, she has a recording of them.
¿Y puedes hablarnos del comportamiento de estas entidades sobre los pacientes? ¿Cómo crees que le influyen sus objetivos? ¿Cómo llegaron a apoderarse de esa persona? Si hay algunas circunstancias que la hagan más fáciles para esa parasitación.
Yeah. Severe physical, emotional, sexual abuse opens them up. And so the voices are like sharks smelling blood. When they feel somebody generating negative emotion, it attracts them. Okay. The other thing that attracts them is amphetamine. When somebody takes amphetamine, it just opens them up and it's like, come and get me. And the fourth thing is Ouija boards. I've talked to several people who went psychotic on Ouija boards. They were playing with the Ouija board and whatever the spirit was answering them, and then it got into their head and it stayed there and it never went away. Ouija boards are very dangerous.
Según él ha descubierto, el objetivo de estas entidades es la parasitación energética, el drenaje energético.
That's what they feed off of. They feed off of that negative emotional energy. That's their food. Yeah, comida.
¿Has recibido ataques o amenazas de estas entidades directamente hacia ti? O gente que está involucrada, por ejemplo, la corporación, que es quien controla el planeta, ¿te han amenazado por haber descubierto esta gran realidad en el mundo?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've had my battles with them. They almost killed me once. It was, I haven't got to that part yet. It happened in the prison. But there was one time where I was about to go public with this information. I went, this is important. People need to know this. You know, and I was going to be interviewed by one of the biggest podcasters in the U.S. Okay, and I was down in Mexico, and feeling fine, nothing was wrong. I woke up one morning and I couldn't move my arm, my right arm. It was killing me. It was just so painful, and I didn't injure it. I didn't do anything to it. All of a sudden, it just was painful, and I couldn't move it, and it was getting worse by the day. So I told my friend I was down there with, I was on vacation with them, and I said, I'm not going to go to a Mexican hospital. I need to get back up into Tucson. I said, this is getting worse. So as soon as I got back, I went to the emergency room. They admitted me immediately. It turned out that a staph infection had exploded in my right shoulder, and it was life-threatening. So they put me in surgery the next day. It all happened so fast, but it knocked me out of doing that interview. I couldn't do the interview because I was in pain and I couldn't move my arm and I was full of drugs. So I'm virtually certain they did that because I didn't do anything to that arm. I didn't even know you could get a staph infection anywhere than in your throat. I had no idea you could get a staph infection in your shoulder. That blew me away, And I asked the doctor, I said, well, how common is this? And he said, it's not very common, but
Yeah.
It knocked me out from doing that interview. And it took 6 months until I could do it, but I did go back and do it. So it was like, screw them, in spite of them, I went back and I'm doing it anyway, you bastards.
Nosotros estamos muy acostumbrados a ese tipo de ataques de muchos tipos.
Yeah, when I'm doing interviews, I'm surprised there wasn't any trouble with this one. Usually there's electrical interference, some kind of electronic interference with the interviews. The screen goes bad or the signal gets weak or something goes out or Zoom craps out it's almost expected now. It happens so frequently. And it's only when I'm talking about this kind of stuff.
Porque se mueven por ahí, por la electricidad. Estas entidades lo que hacen es que se mueven por las corrientes eléctricas y por eso se comunican también con las psicofonías, con equipos, por ejemplo, eléctricos y tal, la televisión, te pueden estropear el sistema eléctrico porque ellos lo controlan todo eso. Y además nos mantienen esclavizados con ese sistema eléctrico, por eso está electrificado todo el planeta. Sí, sí, coincide todo.
Yeah, they need the extra energy to get through. So the noise and static, they use that extra energy to get through to the patient. You know, static like television noise, fan noise. I mean, any kind of noise, they can use that to get through better. They kind of piggyback onto that noise. Here's these patterns starting to emerge. I'm still at the state hospital at this point. So other ones started coming up. They got louder after sunset. Here's all these patients saying the voices get louder when the sun goes down. And it wasn't just one saying this, they were almost all saying this. So I'm like, why would a hallucination care about the sun? They get louder when ignored. So I was with a psychiatrist once with one of my patients, and the psychiatrist is telling the patient, oh, they're just hallucinations, just ignore them. So I went, well, that's odd. So I called that patient in a week later, called him into my office, and I said, I was in there with you when the psychiatrist told you to ignore your voices. I said, how did that work for you? He said it didn't. He said they got much louder when I tried to ignore them. So then I started asking all these other patients, what happens when you ignore the voices? All of them said they get louder. They will not be ignored. So here's pattern after pattern after pattern coming up. You know, the next one was they foster self-destructive behavior. They tell the patient to do stuff that's going to get them in trouble, get them in fights, get them in trouble in school, get them kicked out of class, get them in trouble with authorities. They're trying to foster self-destructive behavior. They're trying to tell the patient to do stuff that's destroying them and making their life miserable. So here's pattern after pattern after pattern coming up. And this is just at the state hospital. And I still didn't know what these things were. You know, I just found it odd that they're running patterns. And, you know, the fact that they're running patterns shows that they're not hallucinations, because hallucinations don't run patterns. So I knew that, but I didn't know what they were. And I didn't want to believe that they were evil spirits or demons or anything like that. I was still thinking, well, it's something going wrong with their subconscious mind. I mean, something's wrong there. And I was so frustrated because I couldn't get at the information I really wanted to get at. I mean, they would, a lot of them wouldn't give me that information. And I had to be very careful that they didn't run to a psychiatrist and say, hey, he's asking us questions about the voices again, because I could have got fired. So I had to keep a real low profile at the state hospital. I spent about 7 years there, and I learned basically what I told you up to this point while I was at the state hospital. But there were other things that didn't make sense. So I'd asked, we were taught in graduate school that schizophrenia is due to a chemical imbalance of the brain in the schizophrenic. Okay? Now, I would watch psychiatrists talk to patients and then just sit there and prescribe some medication. If there's a chemical imbalance of the brain, wouldn't you think they would need a baseline? What chemicals are out of balance in the brain? How much are they out of balance? You know, some kind of baseline before they started writing prescriptions. Never happened. You know, I watched scores of psychiatrists write prescriptions. They never gave any kind of objective test. There was no lab work. There was no x-rays. There was no EKG, EEGs. There was no kind of test given to ever determine what chemicals in the brain were out of balance and by how much. Ever. They never had a baseline. It was like they had a dartboard and they throw the dart at okay, we'll start off with this medicine. And if that doesn't work, we'll try this one. And if that doesn't work, we'll increase the dosage. If that doesn't work, we'll decrease the dosage. If that doesn't work, we'll add more medicines. So it was every permutation of different medicines you could imagine, but there was no baseline. So one day I asked one of the psychiatrists, I said, if this is a chemical brain imbalance, and you're not giving any kind of test to determine what chemicals are out of balance in the brain, how do you know what chemicals, what what chemicals are out of balance or by how much? How do you know that? Oh, the drug companies tell us that. We just do what the drug companies say. I'm like, you what? It's like it was incomprehensible to me. It was like letting the wolf in the chicken coop. I mean, it was just, I couldn't believe it, but that's what they were doing. Not only do they not know what chemicals are out of balance or by how much, they don't even know what the chemical balance of the brain should be. They don't know shit. They don't know anything. It's just, they made this up. And I went, where did that come from? That came from a drug company by the name of Eli Lilly back in the 70s when they came out with Prozac. They didn't know what caused schizophrenia. They looked dumb, so they had to make something up. So they made up this chemical brain imbalance saying, oh, well, if our chemicals help somewhat, it must be something to do with the brain. And then they published that. Nobody countered it. It took another decade before researchers came out and started saying, we don't see any chemical imbalance of the brain. What are you talking about? And then they tried to suppress that information. But before that, they were blaming it on mothers. They would tell mothers, well, the mothers did something bad to cause schizophrenia. We're not quite sure what they did, but they did something. The mothers went, we didn't do anything. What did we do? But that was observable. So they had to switch it to something that was not observable, out of the purview of most people. So they went with genetics. They went, well, oh, it's a genetic abnormality. There's a genetic predisposition. It's got to do with the genes. And then it took another decade for some geneticists to actually investigate this, and they found there was no genetic gene for schizophrenia. And then they published that, and the psychiatric mafia and big pharma went nuts, and they went, well, it's not just one gene, it's a whole bunch of genes, and they're all tangled up together, and we'll figure it out one day, but we know it's the genes, And it's like, it was a lie. It was another lie. So then once that went down, and the geneticists said there is no genetic marker for schizophrenia, so they concocted the lie about the chemical imbalance. And that has long been disproven conclusively. But they're still advertising that. They're still teaching it in the universities, and it's a lie. It's concocted by the drug companies to sell drugs. These people do not want people recovering from schizophrenia. They're making $14.7 billion a year selling antipsychotic drugs that do nothing other than tamp down the symptoms. They don't cure anything. The voices are still there. The bad behavior is still there. It's just tamped down. It's not as bad. So they don't cause as much trouble when they're tranquilized. These are major tranquilizers. They don't cure anything, and they never will, because these voices are energetic entities. They are not physical entities. So what they're doing is like if you got a big magnet and you look at it, you don't see a magnetic field. You don't see it, you don't smell it, you don't taste it. You can't. It's just, for all practical purposes, it's invisible. It's there, but you can't see it. You can't detect it. You get a bottle of iron filings and you put that on the magnet. Now you can see the pattern. Okay? Now it's visible. These patterns are the iron filings for schizophrenia. These are the operational definition of these entities. This is what they do. This is how they react. This is how they behave. And we got 23 of them. They're all listed on my website under articles at jerrymarzinsky.com. You can go there and see them for yourself. They're right there in front of you. Any psychiatrist, any counselor, any doctor can go there and see these for themselves. And if they look at their schizophrenic patients, they will see them. They're patterns. Hallucinations don't have patterns. So this hallucination stuff is a total lie. They've not done any research on it at all. They're like the Egyptian priests that just come out and go, we hereby pronounce that the voices are hallucinations because we said so. There's no research to back it up at all. Zero.
Lo ocultan, es una manipulación mundial, a nivel mundial, y lo ocultan a través de las corporaciones y tal. Lo que están haciendo es dormir a la gente que tiene percepción de estas entidades y que van a hablar sobre estas entidades, los van a destapar, los medican para que se callen. Y es a nivel mundial, están todos compinchados, toda la corporación. Sí, sí, sí. Y él lo confirma.
Cuando hacemos este tipo de limpieza y liberación energéticas, usamos la energía propia o la energía del alma, del ánima, o como lo llame cada uno, ¿no? Procurando no conectar con nada externo, porque un poco estas entidades lo que quieren es que conectes con algo externo y hagas una especie de pactos o contratos involuntarios, ¿no? Implícitos. Es mejor no conectar con nada externo. Luego, si quieres, podemos comentar el tema de la religión y tal. ¿Ha utilizado algún método de sanación o liberación de estas voces, entidades, y qué resultados ha obtenido?
Yeah, and I found that very interesting when I read your book. So
Okay.
I'm gonna experiment with that. I have patients even now that now the other thing they don't like is what I saw at the state hospital. They gave shock treatments. You know, they put the electrodes and shock the brain. Okay, what I noticed is that after those shocks, the voices would disappear for a day or a week. You know, they would vanish, but they would always come back. So that electricity somehow they didn't like it. Okay, and then I read a book called 30 Years Among the Dead, where a psychiatrist was administering static electric shocks to the patient, and the voices would experience that as painful lightning storms, and they would leave, and the psychiatrist's wife was a psychic. She would take the voice and talk them into the light, and then once they went into the light, they were gone. And I tried that myself, and it does work, but I don't like talking to them. I feel like I shouldn't be talking to them, but I did test it out and it does work. Now, I've got a couple of patients now that are using TENS machines. They're the machines to administer slight electrical shocks for muscle pain, and they're using them against the voices, and they're shutting the voices up. So I don't know how long it would last. We're still experimenting with it, but it is working. You know, they're low electrical shocks that they use for pain. You know, and the machines are very inexpensive. You know, and they're shutting the voices up. Now, I don't know whether they'll stay away. They're parasites. I'm thinking if you can drive them away for long enough, they'll starve and they'll move on because they're not feeding off of those patients who are when they got those shock machines on. Now, this is only based on 3 or 4 patients right now. So I don't know how valid it is. We're still experimenting with it.
Según su experiencia, ¿cómo debemos prepararnos y protegernos de estas entidades? Con su experiencia hasta ahora, y en caso de padecerlas, ¿qué podríamos hacer? Según lo que él utiliza o lo que él sabe.
I think one of the main things they need to understand is that not all thoughts that come into your head belong to you. These things can put thoughts in your mind, and that's what they do. They put the thoughts in the schizophrenic's mind, and it sounds, you know, it's not like what you think. It's not like, you know, we're the voices, or it doesn't sound anything like that. It sounds just like all the other thousands of thoughts you have in a regular day. There's no difference in tempo or loudness, or they sound just like all the rest of your thoughts. Only the intention and the content is very different. Okay? So all of a sudden you'll get an intrusive thought like, oh, you stupid jerk, or, you know, why did I do that, or why did I say that? That's them. They hit everybody, not just the schizophrenics. It's much more noticeable with the schizophrenics because they're hitting them constantly, but they hit us all. They're always hitting us. Every negative thought that comes through your mind comes from them. You know, so what we think, because we hear the voice in our head, we think that it belongs to us because it's happening in our head. So we go, well, that belongs to me. No, that's not true. You know, a good number of the thoughts that enter your head do not belong to you. You know, you turn on the television, none of those thoughts belong to you. All this garbage news coming out, this negativity, this murders and disasters and all that kind of crap, you know. And even when you're, you know, just driving along, I mean, and all of a sudden just a bad thought comes into your head and you go, where did that come from? You know it doesn't belong to you. Emanuel Swedenborg, a Christian mystic who lived 300 years ago, he said, none of your thoughts belong to you. They either come in from heaven or they come in from hell. You're the chooser. You're the one who chooses which ones you want to pay attention to, because the ones you pay attention to are the ones that you're giving your energy to. Okay? So what happens with these people that are badly psychologically, physically, or sexually abused? They're at a very low frequency. Right? So they're attracting these things. They're paying attention to the negative because that's what they experience. That's what they expect. So these things are feeding on them. You know, that's where the Mace energy method comes in. It's a new cutting-edge psychotherapy that gets rid of these mental programs, that foster guilt and shame. So from what I see, there's two things happening. You got entities attacking you, and you've got like a mind virus that is caused by trauma that you've had in your life. And that trauma causes a program that tells you this is the way the world is when it's not. Okay? And it's subconscious because the ego takes that pain and that trauma and it buries it into subconscious so you don't have to experience it. But what happens then is every time somebody shows up in your psychological sphere, like the person who traumatized you, that thing reacts, it triggers, it goes off, and it causes an upset. And that upset, that thing tells you it's out there. It's not in you. It's out there. It's that person there. They're the one causing it. Either beat them up or abuse them or get rid of them or run from them or get away from them. And the universe keeps sending you people like that, telling you something is wrong. Something's off with your programming. And the Mace energy method goes in there, and it's an energetic therapy, and it will dissolve that stuff. It will be gone. So there were no more reactions to the person who abused you. And the person who abused you, the memory of them is like, okay, they did it, but there's no more emotional pain to it. It's an energetic therapy. So it consists of a spiritual component and a psychological or scientific component. Because what you're dealing with is energy. The spirit is energy. Your feelings are energy. Your thoughts are energy. It's all energy. And what psychiatry is doing is like the magnet we talked about. Here you've got an energy field. It's like they're taking Thorazine or psychiatric drugs and pouring it on top of that energetic field and expecting it to disappear. It does not. The voices are still there. The schizophrenia is still there. They might be gumming up the works a little bit and calming down the brain because it's drugged up, but they're not getting rid of anything. They're not getting rid of that magnetic field because these entities are energetic. They're energy. They're not physical. You can't get rid of them by physical means. It's a spiritual battle. So these things can go into your mind because your mind is energy. They can pull up every rotten thing you've ever done and rub it in your face. I had patients where the voices went in there and they owed somebody a quarter that they borrowed 20 years ago and never paid them back. The voice came out with that. So you see what a bad person you are? You never paid that guy back his quarter and he's poor, and they started attacking him for that. So they can go in there and they can pull up every rotten thing you've ever done and throw it in your face over and over again. That's like when, remuneration. Animals don't do that. A person does something bad and they go, oh, I shouldn't have done that. And why did I do that? And, oh, now they hate me. And it just goes on and on and on and on. That's them. It's generating that negative emotional energy. An animal, something bad happens to it and that gets over with, and then it just goes on about its life. It doesn't keep going, oh, well, I did this and I did that and I shouldn't have said this and I shouldn't have done that. It doesn't happen. It's only unique to humans.
Y el caso, si puedes comentarnos, el caso más impactante que has tenido, el que más te ha llamado la atención, ¿cuál es?
Tell you what, I can do better than that. I got a poem written by one. Okay. This guy murdered 3 people. He cut his girlfriend to pieces. All right. And they still haven't found her body. So his mother sent me this poem he wrote. So this guy is locked up in a Colorado prison in a maximum security unit in isolation. That's how dangerous he is. Okay. So he wrote this about his voices. So they still haven't found the pieces of his girlfriend. They know he cut her up into little pieces and they don't know where she is. Okay, so the voices completely took this guy over. He says, now he's writing about the voices. Okay, and he names this thing. He says, "There is a monster" is the name of his poem. So he said, "There is a monster that lives in my head. This monster is real. It's not under my bed. My monster tells me things to do. It tells me sometimes when news is new." Okay, so it tells him things. He said, "My monster is crying as it spent all the years, drowning out my courage and disposing my fears. My monster is strong. That's what I like to think. My monster is coming when it's time to drink." So here he's saying when he drinks alcohol, the monster comes out and gets even worse. He said, "My monster is ready. My monster is strong." And they get supernaturally strong. I mean, schizophrenics get supernaturally strong. I mean, I can tell you one story where the guy was like, he was like Superman. I mean, it happened in the prison. So they get, their strength is beyond comprehension. It just doesn't fit a regular person at all, even weightlifters. So he said, "My monster's ready. My monster is strong." So it's saying its monster's ready to fight anytime and protect him. What will I do when my monster is gone? So he knows that monster's protecting him. My monster will never leave. That is his plan. It overwhelms me when I'm making a stand. Okay, so what he's saying there is like when he gets into a fight, the monster overwhelms him and takes over. You know, very seldom do these guys lose a fight in the prison. And guards learn not to irritate them, not to pick on them. There is a monster inside of me. I thought I was strong. How could this be? My monster has a name too. He walks in the dark whispering Yazoo. My monsters are watching me. He won't tell you my name. My monster is the shadows that you cannot see. His heart is heavy. He plays for the game. So he plays for keeps. My monster is aware. He wants to be monster. He's like the blood from a lake. His bond is with me now, monster. He has nothing else to do. My monster is aware. The monster was his voices. They completely took him over. I only know one other patient where they completely took him over. You know, and that guy, he came into the emergency room one day when I was working at the prison, and then the last 10 years I was worked for anybody. I was working psych crisis in emergency rooms in hospitals around Tucson. So psych patients would come into the emergency room and we'd have to figure out what to do with them. Right? So this guy, his parents moved out of Phoenix and he stayed behind with his girlfriend. He couldn't get a job. He was living off his girlfriend. His girlfriend was starting to get fed up with it. He was hearing voices. She locked herself in the bedroom at night because she didn't feel safe with him. And then one night, she heard him go out of the apartment, and he went out into the grass in the middle of the grass, and she's watching him from the window, and he had a big butcher knife, and he was stabbing the grass over and over again with this big butcher knife. So she freaked out and she locked the door, didn't let him back in. He's pounding on the door, and she called the police. So he ran, and then he called his parents, who were in Phoenix. They were probably 400 miles away. His dad gave him money to come to them. Okay, so he's living with them, and he's angry. He's fighting with his brothers. He's yelling at his father. He's just very upset, and they would call him by his right name. You know, the name he was given, like Rick or John or something like that. And every time they would call him by his given name, he would get furious and he would say, "I'm not John. I'm Joe." You know, he would get mad at them and say, "Call me Joe. John is dead." So telling the family that the person they knew was dead and that he had taken over. Okay. So what he did is he attacked his father when his father called him by the right name, and his brother Big Brother came and beat the crap out of them, and then he threatened them to burn their house down or something like that, saying, ordered them out of the house, said, "This is my house." So they called the police and they hauled him into the emergency room. So he was gone. You know, he believed he was somebody else. They had taken him over too. But that's very rare. Usually there's something left in the person still fighting these things. You know, so what they do is they try to push the original personality out. They get them to believe that the voices they're hearing belong to them. And if they think that their voices are them, then they slowly take them over and they push the personality out, and they're running the show. The prison is full of schizophrenics. They shut down all the state hospitals over here, and now they can't work. You know, they have to steal to survive, or sell drugs, and the prison is full of them. And all they're doing is drugging them with drugs. That nothing's changing. So here they are. It's like a graduate school for psychotic prisoners. They get abused, they get beat up, they're in a hardened, nasty environment, and then when their term is over, when their prison sentence is over, they just kick them out to the street with $50 and say, "Okay, you did your time, you're free to go." And of course, they go out there and they're in worse shape than when they ever went in. So the recidivism rate here in the prisons in the U.S. is between 50 and 75%. Very few of those people ever make it in society.
Que la parasitación es a nivel global, a nivel mundial, y que forma parte de las agendas de control planetario que estamos sufriendo actualmente. Esta parasitación en concreto de los esquizofrénicos, de las voces, pero ¿es una parasitación puntual según su experiencia o es global y forma parte de la agenda actuales?
Yes, it's global. Yeah, it's
Global control.
Global control. And if you look at there's 23 of these patterns. Okay, if you look at those patterns, they're exactly what's coming over the mainstream media, over the televisions right now. These leaders in the Western world are eaten up with these demons. They're full of them. Look what's happening. You got Ukraine, where they kill 500,000 people. For what? You know, for what? You know, the Russians won that war, you know, long ago, and they're still the NATO is still funding. The NATO is supposed to be a defensive organization. They got NATO generals in bunkers down there running that war, and the Russians are blowing them up one after another. Hundreds of NATO generals and officers have been blown up already by the Russians. They've got no business in there. You know, they're bleeding Ukraine. They've killed an entire generation, and they're still sending money and weapons over there, and they don't have any soldiers that know how to use those weapons. So it's contractors that are running those missiles that are striking Russia. And Russia knows it. We're on the verge of a nuclear war because NATO has attacked Russia. Putin is the only adult in the neighborhood. His patience is unbelievable. I mean, they're striking one after another. They're blowing up his airplanes. They're blowing up his bases. They fired one missile 1,400 miles from Ukraine. And he still hasn't resorted to nuclear weapons, but he's threatening to, and they're keeping it up. You know, and the U.S. is the leader. They're the bastards in the bunch. You know, and it's not Biden. Biden isn't running anything. He's a stupid, brainless puppet. He's a clone. He does whatever they say. It's the military-industrial complex who's running this. It's the corporations that are running this. It's Soros who's running this. It's the bankers who's running this. You know, they stole the election last time here in the United States, and they put in all these puppets to benefit just themselves, right? And now look at the disaster we're facing. You know, our economy here is on the verge of collapse. All Western European countries are in bad shape. You know, Russia's economy is it's moderate. It's doing well. You know, but here's these bastards: war, more war. You know, now the U.S. is supporting Israel for what? What good is Israel to us? You know, there is no benefit Israel gives us. They're constantly dragging us into war. They're constantly, you know, buying our military equipment. So the military-industrial complex loves that. But yeah, all the leaders in the Western world, except for the guy in Hungary, you know, they've lost their minds. The leader of Hungary, the president of Hungary, is the only sane one in the bunch. You know, the rest are a bunch of lunatics. You know, they can't beat even if NATO went up against the Russians right now, they couldn't win. All their weapons are depleted. They're insane. Their heads are crawling with these entities. You know, and they have stolen power all around the world. So this is a global thing.
Gracias, Jerry, porque nos has confirmado un montón de investigaciones que llevamos a cabo sobre estas entidades arconte que controlan a la humanidad y que están colaborando, quienes están en lo más alto de la cima del poder, de la pirámide del poder aquí en la Tierra. Y bueno, ha sido un placer tenerte aquí, de verdad.
Well, what I'd like to do is quickly finish up the story that I was telling, because you were asking me, did I have any interactions with them? Did they attack me? You know, what happened? So after I left the hospital, okay, the big state hospital with the thousands of psychiatric patients, I went back to the PhD program, got admitted to supposedly one of the best programs in the country. They didn't know anything. They didn't freaking know anything. They didn't know anything that would matter on the front lines with the clinical stuff. They didn't know. They didn't know how the mind worked. There was no spiritual anything to them. They were spiritually devoid, you know, and we're spiritual beings. They didn't know anything. The 2 years of that was all I could stand. So I left there. I went and eventually got a job in the psychology department of the state prison. Okay. And I was sick of schizophrenics. You know, by the time I left the state hospital, I didn't want to see them anymore. They were driving me crazy. I didn't know what was going on with them. I didn't know what these voices were. I didn't want to believe in demons. Nothing was making sense. I was like, just get me away from them for a while. I need a break. I don't want to deal with them anymore. And I still didn't know what the voices were. You know, I didn't want to believe in demons. So I was like, get me away from them. So I was away from them for 2 years, you know, and then maybe 3. And then when I got back into the psychology department of the state prison, here they were again, hundreds of them, more than it was in the state hospital. You know, I had a whole unit full of them, you know. So what I did is I got together with the ones that would tell me what their voices were saying in real time. So when we're in my office talking, I said, I want you to tell me every time the voices tell you something, I want you to tell me what they're saying. Okay. So I would be able to talk to the voices through them. They would tell me what the voices were saying, and then I'd speak down to the voices and tell them the voices didn't like me. And then I would be able to speak to them through them. So I had a group of about 10 to 15 of them around me all the time who agreed to do the same thing. Okay? Now, not all of them wanted to do it because the voices would take repercussions. The voices didn't want them talking to me, and they would make some of their lives miserable. Not all of them wanted to do it, but I always had 10 or 15 of them around me all the time, always asking them questions. What are the voices saying? How are they reacting to this? What are they doing now? You know, so I was getting real-time feedback right there immediately. You can tell them that. Now
Okay.
that didn't happen in the state hospital. I couldn't do that at the state hospital. So if one of those patients, one of those prisoners I was working with didn't like what I was doing, and they went to the warden or went to the captain of the prison and said, oh, the psych is asking us questions about our voices and I don't like it. They would say, get out of my face, get out, go play into traffic, man. That didn't even come anywhere near the line to where they would cause them any concern. So I was really able to get a lot of research done in the prison, you know, because I was unhindered until they started recovering. Once they started recovering and getting rid of the voices, then I got in trouble. So what I would do is I would bombard these guys with questions, and more patterns started coming out. So I got to wondering what would happen if I started interfering with those patterns. What would happen if I threw a monkey wrench in those patterns and started messing up the patterns that these things were running, telling the patients to do the opposite of what the voices were telling the patient to do. Okay? So disrupting their patterns. And it didn't take long before the these prisoners in this group came back and told me the voices don't like what you're doing. They don't want us coming here. They start screaming and hollering every time we come here. They don't want us coming here. They're telling us not to come, not to visit you. They're telling us you're crazy, you're stupid. What you're doing makes no sense. They're doing everything they can to keep us from coming. But I have to hand it to them. They kept coming. Okay? They kept reporting what these things were saying. So here they're, and it's all of them. They're all saying the same thing. The voices don't like what you're doing. They don't like you interfering. They don't want to. All of them are saying the same thing, and they didn't know each other. So it's independent. So one day, after working with one guy, he turns around in my doorway on the way out of the office, and he says, "You know what you're doing is dangerous, don't you?" And I just looked at him and said, "Well, that didn't make any sense." Well, I didn't say anything. I just looked at him like, "Where'd that come from?" I'm thinking they're in your head. They're not in my head. Where'd that come from? I didn't ignore it. I just kind of put it in the memory, just held it back there. They're getting more and more upset with what I was doing because I was interfering with what they were doing with these patients. And I'd give the patients homework or the prisoners homework every week, and then they would come back and tell me what effect it had on the voices. And the voices were getting more and more upset. They didn't like it. Okay, so here's more and more evidence coming in that these voices aren't hallucinations. But I didn't want to believe that they were demons or evil spirits. I just didn't want to believe that. But here's this more and more evidence coming in, and my denial system's getting shakier and shakier. But I still didn't want to believe it. So one day, one of the guys I was working with, somehow he got into the medical unit where the psychology department was, and he knocks on my office door. I open the door, and I don't know how he get in because I didn't give him a pass. And he tells me, the voices want to talk to you. And I'm like, they want to talk to me personally? I asked him. That had never happened before. In the 20 years I'd been working with schizophrenics, the voices never spoke to me directly. They always spoke through the patient. This was something new. So it kind of took me aback. And I'm like, they want to talk to me directly? They want to speak to me? And he goes, yeah, they want to speak to you directly. I said, well, come on in. We sat him down, closed the door, and I said, what do they have to say? And these words came out of his mouth. You have no right to interfere with our way of life. Our way of life. And the prisoner said, that wasn't me. That was them telling you that. It wasn't my words. That was them. And it would have been dangerous for him to play those kind of games with my head, because I had a lot more power than he did. But he was serious. He said, that didn't come from me. And then I went to respond back and I said, well, tell them this. And he said, I don't have to tell them anything. They can see you. They can hear you. They can hear everything you say. They can see everything you say. They can see you right now. And that took me back. I didn't know they could do that. After that, after he left, my mind just went boom. It was like they are entities. They are separate entities. This is no hallucination. This is no trick of the subconscious. This is no chemical imbalance, anything. These are entities. And I was so shocked, I closed my office for the rest of the day and just stared out the window. But I didn't stop. I still kept working with these guys. And then one day, I was reading a book by Miguel Ruiz who was talking about these voices being parasites. So I decided to bring that into the prison and read it to one of the guys I'd been working with, okay, and ask him what he thought of that. So I brought him in, and I'd worked with him for like 6 months. He was getting better. And I went to read it. I said, I got this book. I want to read you this paragraph and let me know what you think about it. Because I was always asking them questions. I was constantly bombarding them with questions. So I started reading it, and it got to the part where it was talking about the voices being parasites, vampires. I look over at him, and he's got this zombie look on his face. And then all of a sudden, there's this electrical crackling breaks out right behind my head. It sounded just like an arc welder. It was crack, 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 crack. And I'm like freaked out. And I look at him and I said, do you hear that? And he doesn't say anything. He's just staring at me with this weird zombie-like stare. So I went, he's going to attack. And I pushed my chair against the wall so I could kick him back if he came at me. And this crackling kept going on and on and on. And it was loud. It didn't just last a few seconds. It went all the way up the right wall of my office, crackling all the way, like crack, 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 crack. And then across the ceiling, cracking, cracking all the way across the ceiling and down the other wall. It must have lasted 25, 30 seconds. And then it jumped into this Rubbermaid trash can right near my leg. And I bent over and I looked at it, and there was nothing in there. The inmate porter had cleaned it the night before. And the whole time I was kind of trying to keep an eye on him and trying to see what was causing this crackling noise. And I couldn't see anything. There was nothing visible. And then all of a sudden he gets up very slowly and he goes, I gotta leave. And he kind of shuffles out of the office. And I'm like, go, get out of here. Go, leave. And so he leaves. And I get up and I examine the walls and I don't see any burn marks on them. I don't see any reason that could have happened. It made no sense. I run out into the hall and I look at the other offices and they're still locked. Nobody's in there. There's no cause for this crackling that lasted almost a half a minute. So I was completely blown away. I'm like, what am I getting into? I didn't think these things could affect physical reality. And right here in front of my face, they did. They caused that crackling sound. I'm like, where is this leading? How much trouble am I going to get into? I don't have a cognitive map of any of this. I don't know anybody who's been here before. There was nobody I could talk to. I couldn't even talk to my wife. I was starting to think I was going nuts, but I couldn't talk to anybody because I knew what they would think, especially my colleagues. So I had to keep all this to myself until I met Sherry, the co-author of the book that we wrote. Okay. Now she heard these voices earlier. Now I had somebody to talk to finally. Okay. So what happened is about 3 months later, I finally got the nerve up to call this guy back into my office, this guy where the crackling was. And he looked good. I thought he would be a wreck. He looked good. And he sat down and we did some small talk. And I said, hey man, do you remember the last time you were in my office? Did you hear that crackling noise? He said, yeah, I heard it, but I'm surprised that you did. And I said, what was that? And he said, that was them. I said, them who? He said, the voices. That was the voices. And I said, well, what the hell were they doing? He said, they were trying to scare you off. And I told him, well, they did a damn good job of it. And I said, you look weird when you got up and walked out of my office. I said, what were the voices telling you when you walked out of my office? He said, they were telling me to go get a shank, which is a homemade prison knife, and stick it in your gut. And I said, oh, he wouldn't do that. I worked with him for 6 months. I said, he wouldn't do that. And I asked him, well, why didn't you do it? And he said, I couldn't find one and nobody would give me one.
Wow.
So it was then I started wondering, what am I getting into? But I also knew, once I knew that these things were entities, I knew I had to let people know. I mean, it was like, I couldn't just keep that to myself. I had to let people know that these things were real, that this is what was causing schizophrenia. If you can get rid of those voices by any means, all symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia disappear with them. So it was when some of these prisoners started recovering fully, they no longer needed medicine, that the chief psychologist started wondering what I was doing, and he started investigating. And of course, I couldn't tell him. So he started asking these prisoners I was working with, and for a long time, they wouldn't tell him either. So he was investigating for almost a year before one of them finally told him what we were doing, and then I was in real hot water. He paced around like a demon. He did not want this happening. He did not want schizophrenics recovering, even though it was saving them money and they were behaving. They weren't causing problems. They were now normal. He didn't want that happening.
Wow.
So
Bueno.
it was at that point that I just turned in my resignation and retired from the prison. And I dropped my license, my counseling license, because I knew they would go after me. I knew they would say, oh, he's crazy or something, stir up some kind of stuff to kind of try to make me look like I was some kind of lunatic or something. So I just dropped it. So I still have the license on record, in good shape, No transgressions, no strikes, no nothing. So now I'm working with the Mace Energy method. You can find out more about it on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com. And this stuff is so far out of their league that it's like, to them, it would be like science fiction. It actually works. Nothing they have works. So they probably are not going to want this out there either. So visit my website at jerrymarzinsky.com. There's a lot more information on there. There's stories on there. There's testimonials on there. There's the patterns are on there.
Sí, es curioso que al final, por distintas vías, mucha gente llega a las mismas conclusiones, que hay unas entidades a nivel planetario, incluso ya a nivel interdimensional y tal, que se dedican a parasitar a la humanidad de distintas formas. Y principalmente una de sus fuentes de alimento es la energía emocional densa o negativa. Entonces comentarle que nosotros estamos también en la lucha contra estas entidades y contra el control que tienen sobre el planeta, y que cualquier cosa que necesite de nosotros, pues aquí estaremos.
Okay. I'd be glad to work with them in any way possible to get this information out. Okay. People need to know it. And, so far they haven't, the psychiatric mafia hasn't attacked me because they know what I'm saying is true. And they have no research into the voices, so they can't point to any research saying, oh yeah, they are hallucinations, because they haven't done any research. They just made it up. They're lying to this entire planet. They're drugging everybody. You walk into a psychiatrist's office, you're going to come out with a diagnosis, you're going to come out with drugs. They'll drug everybody they possibly can. They're giving antipsychotics to kids that are 5 years old, to thousands of them. They have no conscience. It's money, money, money. Okay. But what I can do is I have some people who've experienced schizophrenia and recovered from it. They're willing to talk about it. I could bring them on and let you guys talk to them.
Pues seguiremos ampliando, y muchas gracias por compartir con nosotros. Un fuerte abrazo.